Hello, this is John Reed, and sometimes you leave a show with some regrets. And this is what happened to me at ASUG Tech Connect because I was unable to nail these two guests down for an on-site video. Now, having said that, I did get a pretty cool on-site video. Damn.
Yeah.
All the cities are like, I feel like I'm in a Bob Seger song or something. All the cities are like merging together in my head, like some kind of ongoing tour, like some kind of like circular tour. Okay, I got Brian Dennett and Josh Greenbaum. How are we doing?
Doing great.
Doing good. Yeah, yep. Still got a pulse. You know, it's 2025.
Yep. And I couldn't nail these guys
West
down.
Palm Beach, dude.
Where were we?
Give you a running gag.
I think I'm in denial. I think I'm in denial about West Palm Beach. I think that's what the problem is.
Orlando? Was it Orlando?
Yeah. But anyway, I think what kind of happened was there was a sense of urgency on the ground there, and that's why I really wanted to revisit the show, the ASUG Tech Connect show, and also kind of see what this looks like in the context of the themes for SAP and especially customers this year. And also, when I would talk with the two of you at the show, when I ran into you, you were each chasing down different issues. Josh, you and I were talking a lot about things like enterprise architects and the IT business gap. And Brian, you and I were talking about things like the RISE value proposition for customers and the latest on BTP. And you were hunting down those details for your work. So I felt like we were all on the hunt, and I think we gathered some good stuff. And so we're going to let it rip and see what happens. What do you say?
Let's go.
Sounds like fun.
So, Brian, let me start with you. You were on the hunt for a bunch of stuff. What did you take from that event? And then, like, kind of looking ahead to this year, like, what are the themes that you think the customers you're dealing with are facing?
So, I mean, I think the way that this all can kind of get packaged nicely is the main story is still this story of RISE, or I would say more precisely of modernization, right? And so what does it look like as you're trying to refresh your landscape, as you're trying to get onto the more SaaS-like version of SAP, whether that's RISE or Grow? How do you deal with your legacy code? How do you think about the new world order as it relates to change management and just kind of the general management of your landscape moving forward? And then ultimately, how are you making the appropriate investment in the smattering of different technologies SAP is putting out into the world, especially in the BTP bag, so that you're actually setting up your organization for success? And I think some of those answers are relatively straightforward. I think some of those answers have a tremendous amount of it depends and nuance. And I think that's kind of been the theme, is how do we try and boil that ocean and figure out how to kind of streamline the guidance that customers are really requiring, depending on where they're at in that journey.
And Josh, when I turn it over to you, I just want to throw in this additional backdrop, which is that a lot of these customers are facing some pretty intense deadlines right around migration to S4 or to newer versions of S4, which adds pressure, but also raises fresh questions in terms of, are they really going to accomplish their goals if they stick with a technical migration just to beat the deadline? Kind of like if I were to, fire up Windows 11, I'm sure ASAP hates that analogy, but, am I really solving a problem there in a profound business sense of the word? So isn't that part of what we're thinking about too, is modernization versus deadline pressures?
Yeah, one of my mantras closing out 2024 was don't try to solve a problem for me that I don't actually have. And I feel like there's a lot of this back and forth between SAP and the customers about why it's for HANA, why transformation, why it keeps banging up against this question: is the business problem perceived to be one that can be resolved by technology? Is the technology problem that in front of us perceived as one that could be solved by new technology? And I think, what I really came away from that show feeling very acutely is that SAP and customers to a certain extent are talking across purposes. Now, I mean, to me, the number one, I reflected back on it. obviously in preparation to do this call and for a couple of other reasons. And then I had a couple of very fascinating calls just this morning on these similar topics with some folks in the ecosystem. And, this question of what is the business case moving forward? What does it look like? And how do I stage that business case? Where is it going to go in terms of a technology home? It's really super acute. We talked about this, quite a bit, that some of these customers really don't know how to make a business case for S/4HANA. And so I think, to me, that the problem that really stood out was this issue of, do I need to innovate? If I need to innovate, how do I do that? And what is in it for me, SAP, not necessarily what is in it for you? And that tension was very, very acute there.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, on that subject, because this is something that has ultimately become very near and dear as I've been pulled deeper and deeper into the RISE discussions. And I do think if you kind of read the tea leaves of SAP's strategy, their technology choices, the acquisition, and then the rise in prominence of LeanIX, now of WalkMe, I think that there's a general arc of SAP is trying to put forth the right toolkits and the right philosophy in terms of IT management to support this transformation, whether it ends up being a big bang modernization where you have this enormous RISE-related transformation motion, or whether it becomes a more gradual thing. And again, reading the tea leaves, I do think that we're going to find SAP softens on their messaging a little bit in terms of how aggressively you need to transform, as long as you get on the right path in terms of embracing some of this toolkits, having the appropriate visibility and telemetry to manage that transformation over a longer duration of time. And I think if you get on that path, I think it makes it easier to build those business cases, because you can be a little bit more selective. You can be a little bit more gradual. You can kind of take your shots. You don't have to think about hiring an army to move it all at once. You can use your internal team and kind of chip away at the most critical problems as you see them, not as the technology requires them. And so, I think that's kind of where things are going. That's how things are taking shape from my perspective. But I do think at this point, it's still a little speculative. I think there's a sharper story that SAP needs to put out into the markets if that really is the path SAP and SAP customers are going to end up going down.
Yeah, Josh, I'm gonna jump. Yeah, go ahead, because you and I think are about to say the same thing. But
well, I'm not so sure, because I'm going to push back just a little bit on your thing around customers don't know how to build a business case, because while I think there's some truth to that, and you and I encountered a lot of IT leaders at the show that were challenged to asking us really and asking their peers how to have a better dialogue with lines of business. There's no doubt about that. I don't think SAP's all that good at making business cases for customers either. And the fact of the matter is that
shaking my head, audience, but I'm shaking my head in violent agreement.
Josh is agreeing there, and so, like, one of the things I'll point out is that quote unquote transformation in a RISE or grow context doesn't necessarily mean access to the innovation you're looking for in a different storyline. So, for example, after that show, I interviewed the UK ISUG chair before their show, and he talked about how they had a situation where they needed to get some next-gen ESG functionality around track and trace. And they couldn't get it because it was only available within RISE, and they weren't ready to do RISE yet. And that prompted me to kind of reach out to SAP and kind of say, do you want this? Like, because to me, like, one of the things here is that I think SAP needs to work on further. And I think I want to point out that they've made some progress on this point, but is it the best way to have an innovation partnership to do innovation work together? Like, why would you ever say no to a customer that wants to do innovation with you because they won't enter into a commercial construct like RISE that is a very serious and important decision that requires a real commitment? And why wouldn't you want to build momentum on the innovation side? And Josh, you've documented a number of these examples. Another one that I have that I've been pointing out to SAP is that Cohere is eager to go into on-premise customers and fine-tune an LLM and get customers going on AI right now. But if you talk with SAP about that, half the time it seems like you hear this conversation about rise and grow before AI. And I don't really understand why you would want to say, well, actually, you really have to be in the cloud before you can consume AI through SAP. Now, having said that, the other half of the time you might hear SAP saying, well, you can do this through BTP, right? And I saw some really terrific examples at Tech Connect that actually wrote about in Diginomica about that happening. So in some cases, it really is happening. It's just a matter of a re-emphasis of that. So that's kind of what I'm going to throw back at y'all is like, we have to kind of find this middle ground here because I think everyone needs to move to the center a little bit to make this work.
You're 100% correct, of course. And I think, to me, a lot of this has to do with, as you said, you alluded, I mean, SAP doesn't do a good job with the business case either. And what you were talking about, Brian, with the toolkit, I mean, as John knows, and maybe you know as well, I've been all over Cloud ALM and that set of tools, which is also, suffers from a lack of understanding and a lack of, if you will, marketing towards a business user. The business case the business case can be tremendously aided. In fact, the whole innovation story, it really, SAP has a really distinct competitive advantage for customers if they can, these are works in progress. John's going to call me out, so I'm going to say it right now. It's not fully formed, but there are the elements for telling an incredible story, and telling one that is unique and from a competitive advantage for SAP and unique from a competitive advantage for the customer, because you can really do things, the telemetry within these tools, the capabilities that come out of things like BTP really allow customers to do, very special things. So, it is a lot about, I'm sighing, SAP getting in its own way and needing to get out of its own way to a certain extent with these kind of commercial requirements that inhibit technology innovation.
So I want to ask both of you. Can I ask both of you about Rise real quick? Which is I want to share an anecdote on the ground, and Brian, hopefully that will lead into your next comments as well. So basically, like when Rise first came out and it was billed as transformation as a service, I found that a little bit like over the top, and I thought, wait, isn't this just a hyperscaler management program at its core? But over time, I started to gain a little more appreciation for that notion of transformation as a service. And part of that, Josh, came from our discussions because you've dug pretty deep into tools like Cloud ALM and LeanIX and Signavio and all the potential that those things have to really create a differentiated value proposition for Rise as opposed to just managing a hyperscaler relationship. And so I've been really intrigued by all that, and I'm keeping a very open mind about that, though I think there's a lot of moving parts there. But what happened to me at the show is I decided to crash a big Rise peer group session led by a consulting partner, and it was packed. And I was all ready to go hear about a lot of this stuff. What I heard instead was a whole bunch of really challenging anecdotes around how these folks were managing their relationship with SAP around the program, including things like support. Now, obviously, a lot of this was running at some level of scale, and SAP is really good at running stuff at scale, so there's no criticisms there. But it was things like we have trouble getting access to an enterprise architect and stuff like that. And then, of course, there was discussions that boggled my mind around a 50-plus page spreadsheet called RACI, where vendor, partner, and customer try to track their various responsibilities for managing a hyperscaler relationship. And I have to say, that doesn't really sound like software as a service at its best to me at the moment in time. And so that, to me, clashes a little bit with Josh's push around this transformation as a service methodology. Now, I would like to think that SAP can bring us closer to what Josh is talking about, but I really found myself wondering a little bit about how we're going to get there, and will we get there? Because when I hear some of the public cloud growth stories, they have a real exciting quality, and I've written about those. I really like those. So I'm really curious, Brian, like what you think. Like maybe I just kind of walked into the wrong gripe session, because it wasn't like a comprehensive thing I did. I just picked a session. So maybe I kind of picked the weird session, but there were a lot of customers there. So
Yeah, I mean, you calling out the RACI document around Rise, or I think it's the roles and responsibility document. I think it's like 1,200 or 1,400 lines in an Excel file. It's a brutal thing to go through, and it's brutal for the customer. It's brutal for SAP, but it is one of those things that you kind of have to block and tackle. A shameless plug, that is one of the key value adds of the Lemongrass Advisory offering, is to try and develop as many shortcuts as possible to how you navigate that behemoth. And so those, I do think, are some of just the unfortunate realities of engaging with SAP, and ultimately engaging with SAP on what is ultimately a hybrid, almost interim step to SAP going fully SaaS. And so that, I do think, is kind of the key point in all of this. And I think it's one of the areas where SAP is whiffed in terms of their value story. Is Rise is not just a contractual motion. It's not just a forced transition of some sorts. It is about SAP taking a major leap towards turning into a SaaS product, or a SaaS-like product. And with that, there are two key terms that really become the end-all, be-all for the customer to succeed. One is technical debts, trying to manage it, trying to shed it, trying to get it out of the way. This is why clean core is such a massive topic right now. Why extensibility and BTP, why customization is getting pushed to the side. This is really kind of the crux of that, is as you go to SaaS, and as SAP leans into being more SaaS-y in nature and leverage the data model that comes with that to power their AI strategy, this all then tees up the other important word, which is innovation, right? SAP wants everyone to be on the SaaS-y products so that they can push innovation more aggressively into the customer landscape, so they don't find customers that are 5 years, 8 years back in release cycle anymore. They view that as a unmanageable scenario, because they cannot make sure customers are getting access to the AI niceties that are coming through at a ridiculous pace at this point. And so much of what's going on right now, and even the point you made about, like, sometimes it's a Rise first discussion when you're trying to talk about transformation, and then other times it's like, hey, just talk about BTP and you can do BTP. And I would frame it as BTP is a no regret landing zone for your customizations moving forward. Whether you're already on Rise or going to Rise, if you start investing in that landscape will sit there and play nicely with your core ERP wherever it exists. And I think when you really look at it all in totality, I think SAP should be packaging that story a little bit more elegantly. But that's really what it's all about. Is this is a SaaS product. You want to extend around it so that you can adopt these release cycles at a furious pace moving forward.
And Brian, can I just ask you, if you're working with customers around what you've just described in a Rise context, do you think this is an achievable thing for customers? Are you starting to see customers? Obviously, this is a multi-year journey along this sort of clean core modernization path. Do you think this is an achievable thing?
Yeah, for sure. And I think every day the ecosystem as a whole is getting a little bit better in terms of solving parts of this. There's all these different modernization motions going on. There's PO move, there's BW move, there's partners that have shown up, there's toolkits, there's refined service templates for those things to help you get some of those critical pieces of infrastructure onto BTP, onto those modernized tech stacks, so that you can start to do those no regret investments moving forward. And then as far as the larger ERP transformations, there's better tooling showing up there around how do you think about managing your Z code, your Z object landscape? How do you think about analyzing that to know what you can deprecate? SAP's showing up with stuff. Partners are showing up with stuff. We're building our own IP. I know other partners are building their own IP. Like this path is just going to become cleaner, shorter, easier as time goes on. And every day it feels like someone else is throwing something else in the pile that makes us all a little bit easier.
And I'll just add, that ironically, in the way Rise and Grow are facilitating this, it's been a work in progress ever since the first announcement. And, John and I were discussing this earlier. At the NRF show, SAP made this announcement, S/4HANA for retail, which is a public edition product. So there you got an industry specific, very germane, interesting product that's clean core by definition. Again, there you go. Add some BTP for those tweaks you need. But to me, the story of Rise started, I think, it was a little rough to follow and a little, maybe a little premature in its aspirations. But the good thing is that it's evolving too. So I find it rather heartening that there are these industry products, and there's going to be a lot more of it. And when you again start combining it with some of the tooling you've got for managing the process and the tooling you have in BTP for building out the extensions, it starts making a lot more sense for a lot more customers.
Yeah, and for those listening are like, man, John's giving SAP kind of a hard time here. I think one of the reasons for that, although there is something that I really like that SAP did at Tech Connect that I'll get back to, but one of the reasons I think for that, guys, is because the public cloud edition wasn't a strong story at ASUG Tech Connect. And I think part of the reason for that is obviously you had a lot of traditional SAP customers that are thinking more in terms of the private cloud and that kind of transition. But one thing I give SAP a lot of credit for, going back to Sapphire and the ASUG conference there, was starting to reposition the public cloud around like basically any size enterprise can use this product. And really, I think SAP is gaining a lot of determination and momentum to push that as a viable solution for more and more customers operating at scale. And I did a piece on PwC and running Rise at scale in the services industry recently because I wanted to document that further. And then, Josh, as you alluded to, like seeing a retail edition of that is a really promising sign for me as well to see, because vertical functionality has been one of the big like lingering question marks around the public cloud edition being ready for those large customers.
And S/4HANA in general. I mean,
right. Yeah.
That's been
and so I think it's going to be really an interesting theme to watch that wasn't a strong theme at Tech Connect, but I think it will be potent going forward this year because I get the sense SAP is determined to push that based on these announcements. And the only thing I would say is I think there may also be room, and Josh, you were the one who first raised this with me, to also think about this public cloud edition sidecar type of scenario where it can kind of become an innovation sandbox running alongside some of the other stuff you're doing. So in other words, you may not be totally ready to go to Rise right now, but you want access to some of the new AI, or you want to do some ESG stuff that you want to get into, and you can put it up there. It's different than a BTP related thing, but in some cases it might be better. So I'll be interested to see if that picks up any traction, because I think you and I are the two people on this planet that are most excited about that. And we don't work for SAP, so I'm not sure how much stock listeners can place in that, but I think it's cool.
I think so. We've had talks with our friend Jens Hungerhausen about this as well at DSAC. I think there's an interest certainly over in Europe for this kind of sidecar innovation. I have high hopes that 2025 will be a year in which customer choice emerges as the predominant driver for the contractual relationship with SAP, and not let's just get the cloud numbers going. But with the caveat, that it really, everyone's going to have to be on public cloud or cloud to begin with, and public cloud in particular. And I was just talking to a partner about this morning, an SAP partner, and this I think is a really safe bet, and it's not even a hard one to make. This is going to be a public cloud company moving forward. SAP is going to put more and more and more functionality into the public cloud. The customers are going to be enticed to public cloud, to the clean core, S/4HANA public cloud, precisely because it makes sense for their businesses, not because it's SAP's telling them to. And this is an evolution. We'll see. I think it's a really big. I'm feeling, in the wind, this sense that Sapphire is going to be a major sort of coming out for public cloud in some very important ways.
I completely agree. I do think this is going to be the year of grow. I think SAP has said for a while now that the long-term trajectory is public cloud. And I think we can agree or disagree with whether or not that's real or whether that's aspirational. But I do think that they are taking this seriously, and I think it is a good North Star for SAP. And I think when you think about the challenges for the larger, more complicated organizations to think about adopting public cloud, it does boil down to two things. One is the industry solutions, because there ends up being a lot of nuance there, and that's where you end up seeing a lot of the customization. And so I think that has been a challenge and will continue to be a challenge for SAP, but I think it's a challenge that they will step up and look to tackle more aggressively with this push to public cloud. And then separately, I think there is something to be said for SAP will need to figure out how to get better in terms of mapping and exposing the right endpoints, the right APIs to more comprehensively support extensibility for public cloud, because that really is the limiting factor for the larger, more complicated organizations to think about going down that path, because you still run into all these moments where you have some sort of weird niche requirements of customization and the endpoint doesn't exist or doesn't exist the way you need it to. And now all of a sudden you have to do some sort of custom wrapper and expose some new custom API in order to get access to what you need to accomplish that business use case. And I think the toolkit on the extensibility side, the vision SAP has in terms of how it can be configured, how it can be extended, how Fiori Elements is playing into this, how the build stack is playing into this, how build is now becoming a composable element you can insert into standard screens. Like the extensibility story just continues to blossom and become more robust. Now it's just a question of, is enough of the back end actually exposed to extend it in all the ways that you need to?
Well, and just
Brian,
I just let me add to this because I think it's really important, Brian and John. The thing I was really hunting for in particular, I always am, is more information on Cloud ALM, and this was exactly what one of the sessions I went to was talking about. This idea that using Cloud ALM to manage this, the growing sort of requirement for API and APIs to the rest of the real world, and doing that in a systematic way. So whether that API is extending to an SAP asset or to a non-SAP asset, you're enveloping it in a tool set that can manage it, that can essentially track and trace it, and I hope to evolve. And that's maturing. That's exactly what you're talking about. They're doing that stuff.
And Brian, I think I really like what you said too about the extensibility thing, because this is where I think partners like yourself can really educate in a good way, because so often you hear, oh, it's extensible, it's through BTP, it's all fine, you can build whatever you want, right? And there's a lot of subtleties to exactly what you can and can't do at this moment in time. And that becomes really important when you're looking at a move to the public cloud. And I don't think I ever told you this, Brian, but last spring I moderated a cloud panel at a ASUG pre-con, and one of the best parts was watching a public cloud customer literally challenge other customers in the room. Why aren't you in the public cloud, and taking on some of their fears around security and other stuff? And that really woke me up, because it's been a long time for me since I've heard that type of passion from like a more of a business leader loving their SAP software. Okay. Like you still hear that passion some from like the developer community and stuff like that, because let's face it, SAP has put enormous amount into that over the years. But like to hear that, that's the kind of stuff I haven't yet heard, for example, in a RISE context. Like, and maybe I will someday. Maybe I will someday, but at the moment,
enjoy RISE. Shall we start a new? Enjoy RISE.
Yeah, but at the moment, but when I heard that, I was like, wow, like if SAP can go down that road and get more customers that are like literally advocating for that across the customer base, then I think that changes a lot of things, and I'll be very interested to see where that leads. And Brian, getting back to this, like from a project sense, what are you going to be doing this year in terms of what are the obstacles to helping customers get further along this road? Because obviously there's a lot of deadlines. Josh participated in some studies with Basis Technologies that surfaced a lot of concerns around resource constraints, for example. So when you take everything from resource constraints to integration issues to questions about innovation roadmap to everything else, like what is the biggest challenge you're going to have delivering on that for customers?
Yeah, I mean, these are definitely all a bunch of challenges the ecosystem as a whole is trying to grapple with right now. The logjam is real. The resource shortage in a lot of these areas, I think, is real. The way that we are looking at it and trying to solve it, and the nature of the conversations we're having with SAP as we think about shaping our go-to-market strategy is really around trying to understand where some of this is getting more bloated and more complicated than it actually needs to be. So if you think about that R&R documents, right? Like, sure, it's a behemoth, but there's ways to templatize how you kind of speed run that document. And that's one of the things that we focused on. And if you think about Lemongrass as a whole, for most of their existence, they have focused on how do you expedite and make it easier to do a one-step, two-step migration into the cloud. And they have since gone back to the drawing board and refreshed that IP so that it is certified for RISE. And so their whole shtick is, taking an enormous, multi-hundred terabyte system, and right now on paper, 5 days to get that onto a hyperscaler. We shrink that down to less than a day. If you think about the effort to map out what needs to get migrated and where all the breaking changes can be, other SIs might take a year to kind of go through the exercise of trying to map out the entire landscape and identify all the gotchas. We try and shrink that down to 2 or 3 months. And so I think that pattern of how do we cut the fats, how do we really just boil it down to what are the real technical challenges, and then let's just tackle those and let's get the hard part done. And then all the business transformation that you want to build on top of that or around that, we can participate, we can help enable it, but we don't even necessarily care about owning it. We want to solve the technology part of the problem, which when you boil it down tends to be the bottleneck. And in many cases, it shouldn't have to be the bottleneck. It's about too often these projects get overcomplicated on the technology side, and we're trying to just completely cut through that.
Josh, there's a big piece I want to ask you about. We haven't covered it. Maybe it ties into what you're just about to say. But you and I engaged in several conversations that hit really hard on enterprise architecture, to the point that when we taped a live podcast with ASA, which should be coming out fairly soon if listeners are tracking this podcast, that's what they wanted to hear about. We did a hand poll and they wanted to hear about that and not AI. So that's kind of a big deal in terms of the interest in this topic. What was your take on all of that and how this fits in with that IT business gap and all of that? Did you take something from the event around that?
Well, obviously it was a major topic, and ironically, the EA story is a microcosm of the resource gap problem as well. I mean, that was one of the things that I was looking at. Everybody wants to be an enterprise architect. As you know, you've heard me say this before. It's a persona. It's not a job title. And as you have said very wisely, it's multiple. It's multiple individuals. You can't be doing this with a single superstar. But I think that what I came away from was, and again, sort of the nice thing about letting us sort of mature a little bit in ensuing weeks is that this idea of an enterprise architect really is fundamentally part of this desperate need to have a better alignment with real business goals, and actually not just flip things up to the cloud on a technical for technical migration. And I was very heartened by that, because what I saw at Tech Connect and actually an earlier EA event that Paul Pacina had put together is that these individuals for whom this role is very, very appealing are attracted to it very much because they want to be that facilitator. They want to be that business facilitator. They want to have that liaison. And now, to me, the trick, and this is what I was talking to, the flip side of it is, okay, all this great tooling that we've just been talking about, all this great capabilities now has to be presented to the business audience as part of their toolkit too. It's theirs too. And to bring these different constituencies together. And I think that to me was the walking away from Tech Connect. It was clear whether it's Cloud ALM calm or even rise, the conversation about business value needs to be extended to these specific business audiences. And as we know, I mean, there's going to be a set of Connect conferences coming up in the fall that are going to be precisely targeted to those that business audience. I think that was a real positive for me, seeing that the groundswell of interest in doing that coming out of tech.
So I agree with everything you're saying, and I do think I'm almost a little split in terms of which I believe to be the better way to kind of look at how all this is going. Because on one hand, none of this should happen without business being brought along, because when you boil it all down, this is all in support of business use cases and business transformation. And if you're not making a business impact, why are you doing it to begin with? And so like that's kind of been the fundamental mantra of IT becoming more of a partner of business. That's been the journey of the last 40 plus years as IT has moved away from being treated as a cost center. But on the other side, there's a bit of complexity that comes with that. And if you think about what LeanIX is trying to accomplish, if you think about what Signavio is trying to accomplish, if you think about a subset, not all enterprise architects, but a subset of enterprise architects and what they're trying to accomplish, it's as simple as what is the current state, what is the future state, and then let's start to build out a plan of how you get there. And so if you just get to a point of my future state is I understand where I want to innovate as a business, and I need to ensure that my IT partners are there to support that innovation when the time comes. I think as long as there's that promise, there's that expectation, there's that readiness to support innovation and ideally support it at a faster pace, I think all of a sudden you can go, all right, we're in agreement in terms of that future state and where those handshakes need to happen. Let's now just focus on the technology and how do we get ourselves to a place where you're just moving up the stack and making sure everything is right-sized, best practice, streamlined, well understood, so that when it's time to say jump, you can just respond with how high.
Right. But I think go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
No, you first. Go ahead.
No, I think the problem with the business case from the lead, and this is the complexity of this, is that you could have a business leader saying, I have a problem with inventory turns. Okay, turnover. I've got to deal with that. That's my business problem. They are not necessarily, neither they nor IT are actually well equipped out of the box, if you will, to say, okay, so how do we resolve this with technology? And that becomes the harder part, is how do you take that big idea, fix my inventory turnover problem and turn it into a very specific business architecture and instantiated in these technologies we're talking about. That's hard.
Yeah.
We got a long way to go on that.
I agree. And I think one thing that's been interesting about SAP's strategy, and it shows up in a lot of different ways, is SAP, their UX strategy is driving to this idea of single pane of glass. Like everywhere you look, there's some version of that you kind of feel in all the products and how the products are unifying. And I think that that's something that both business and IT can agree on, is if you can get everything to a place where you're driving everything to single pane of glass, well, now you've got the staging area. Now you know exactly where the business user lives, exactly what their day in and day out looks like, and you know how to pull the right levers to make sure the right new functionality lights up on that single pane of glass. And so I think everyone being able to kind of drive towards that is one place where you can really get some elegant alignment and start focusing on some of the core infrastructure and technical investments required to get there.
And data.
I always know a podcast is going well when I struggle to actually get back in the conversation. So nice job, guys. You're doing a good job of driving this one, and that shows how important these topics are. I did want to point out in a historical context, one of the things I spent time on and we did in our presentation was how, unfortunately, the momentum behind the business process expert fell apart in the BPX community when the process modeling tools kind of went by the wayside, that generation of those tools. But Brian, in most organizations, the vision that SAP had back then, which I think was the right one, was just like some technical folks would evolve into enterprise architects, the best configuration type people on the functional side would become process experts. And so the enterprise architect would essentially have a liaison on the business side by which to have those conversations. And the challenge, opportunity, problem I see for enterprise architects in most projects is they actually need to assume that process expert capability themselves because they just don't have it internally. Josh, you and I did a hand poll, and I think there was one person that had a process expert like on the other side of the fence that they were working with out of like all the people we were talking with. So that's part of the challenge, is that we don't have that. And that's not unique to SAP necessarily. It's just that's where we're standing with this. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on these architects, like you're saying, they have so much scope on the IT side already, and now they're missing some vital sort of counterparts.
But that individual, by the way, I was looking at my notes just this morning, and of course he was presenting in an earlier presentation that day about S/4HANA migration progress, and his company was the only one that was really moving forward. Everyone else in the room was sort of going, we're getting started, we're still sort of, and they were marching, straight and true. Not at the pace SAP, was necessarily dictating in terms of its support timeline, but they were doing it, and that I think that was proof in a way of the proof of concept right there.
Yeah, on this whole BPX community kind of falling apart, like I agree. I think that was a loss for the SAP ecosystem, and I do think with Signavio, we're finally starting to see that really build back up. And I do think what you'll end up seeing in the long run is there'll be 3 different kinds of enterprise architects, ones that are more technically focused, maybe even 4. Maybe one that's landscape technically focused, one that's more solution architect type focused. You'll have one that ends up being more this Signavio, more functional leaning enterprise architect. And then I think the last one will be a more commercially focused enterprise architect. I think those are kind of the different hats, if we're being honest about what enterprise architect really means. And as far as the functional ones go, I've had the pleasure of working in an accounts for a lot of last year that my understanding is they are the biggest consumer of Signavio. And they have built out their entire business process hierarchy. They are continuing to add details to it. They're continuing to refine the best practices in terms of what shows up in Signavio and how they can support that data being managed and refreshed appropriately via technical integrations. And so I've gotten a little glimmer of what the future states of BPX will likely look like for the SAP ecosystem. And I think in a lot of ways, it's going to feel great once SAP customers kind of get over that hump and actually get to a place where they have like a COE of sorts around Signavio and a governance model, a practice and procedure in place to kind of keep it all up to date and make it a living, breathing, workable asset. I do think there is still some pieces missing in the SAP puzzle around workflow and process. And if I think about BPA, business process automation, now being the primary workflow engine for SAP, it's one-offs. There doesn't feel like there's a overarching thing the way there was with the old BPM tech stack that gave you a way to kind of see it all holistically and orchestrate it all holistically and see how one workflow touched the next and so on and so forth. And Signavio allows you to have visibility into some of that, but there isn't necessarily a way to control and orchestrate it. And so I don't know how SAP is going to solve that gap that has reemerged. But I think once that gets solved, all of a sudden process will feel much better moving forward.
Yeah, and just to continue, John, I'm never going to let you do it.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, the thing about the BPX, the sad end of the BPX community and sort of the revitalization of the concept is that, BPX, that generation didn't have the telemetry that we can now pull out of these cloud implementations. And while you're absolutely right that, Brian, we need to have more tooling, if you will, the fact is that the telemetry, the metrics you can pull out of telemetry, you can trace, you can log it, you can analyze it, you can model it. I mean, talk about really, great data. That's foundational. That's foundational molecular, if you will, structure for building anything because that's, what's going, you have some sense of what's going on. So I have high hopes that, as these tools get, evolve themselves and their integration evolves, and that's a big problem. We're going to be able to use that telemetry to do some pretty much amazing things.
And
it's going to be interesting to see ASUG and SAP continue to see if they can develop programming to continue that because I thought the momentum started at Tech Connect around really having the kind of conversation about EAs we're having now, which we can't really do in one podcast. I know that Paul Krachina is trying to single-handedly solve this problem for SAP customers globally. I wish him all the best. That's heroic work. He's going to get a lot of miles, I think. You should follow him if you're You should follow him if you're interested in this topic. But hopefully he gets some help this year, because he shouldn't be like putting on all this stuff on his own. So it's good to see Asa getting involved, and we shall see where that conversation goes.
Yeah.
One thing. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, you're totally right. He has been leading the charge for a while, and I think finally we could say that the cavalry's coming. And the point Josh is making around telemetry is suddenly showing up, that there's so much more opportunity for visibility. I think it is a huge unlock for everyone to be able to like actually go and execute on this vision.
Let's see it. So one other thing I did want to give SAP some credit for, we're not going to have a business AI conversation today. But I have a piece coming up with Walter Sun for those who really want to get back in on that. Walter was at the event, did a good job. I think SAP overall has done an overall good job in its communication around this topic. So I am going to give some kudos since I've been hammering SAP a little bit on this podcast. In fact, I wrote a piece for Digitalnomica on the top 5 AI mistakes vendors are making, which I narrowed down from 15. And I actually put SAP in there because SAP was the only vendor the entire year that acknowledged that there's a tension between the large language model and the context window that goes into the model, and that sometimes those things are in conflict and we get an inaccurate result, which everyone wants to pretend is a solved situation, and we only get accurate stuff, which is an architectural flaw in large language models that no one knows how to fix right now. Sorry, evangelists and marketers. So I give SAP a lot of credit for that kind of thing. And that's just one example. I think SAP has done a really good job with articulating its responsible AI framework. Now, I do have some bones to pick on some other aspects of SAP's AI approach, including some of the pricing issues and confusion around that. But having said that, like just as a general thing, like they set the right tone at the conference. And, that's one thing that we talk a lot with vendors about, is that customers do want to have these conversations with you. They just don't want a sales pitch, but they want to have conversations about use cases and pros and cons and evaluating this stuff. And I talked with a friend of mine that works for a big SI, and he said, a lot of times lately with AI, we're the ones that have to go in with the reality check and explain all the overpromised, overhyped agentic stuff the vendors are pushing and say, well, actually, it's not quite like that, but here's what you can do. And, it's a little bit of a tough love, kind of tough role for them to be put in. But sometimes they win some business out of it too. But anyway, like SAP's, I think, done one of the best jobs of any vendor at that part of it. And that was good to see at Tech Connect on the ground. So.
Yeah, I on the AI front, I think you're spot on in terms of SAP has taken seriously the idea of setting the tone around responsibility, of rolling this out, of setting reasonable expectations. I think one of the interesting phenomena that I've been seeing in the market is AI has become a fantastic catalyst for ideating on use cases, for really kind of driving these what if discussions, these art of the possible type discussions. But when you actually start to boil down these use cases, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 times, it is more of a vanilla process automation opportunity that doesn't necessarily need Gen AI. And that's okay. And if we want to call it Gen
in fact,
AI,
it's actually good, because I just did a thing on how generative technology is about 30 times more expensive than what you would call extractive technology. So it's actually good news when you don't have to use it, which I know a lot of people listening to this on the vendor side probably are screaming in agony right now. But anyway, so continue.
Yeah, no, I just think that we're in an interesting spot in terms of this hype cycle that we're in, because it's driving a lot of good outcomes. But I think there's still some sobering that has to happen in the market around what are we actually trying to accomplish. And it's okay if the final toolkit that you're picking has some ML niceties, some doc extraction or whatever the case may be, and it's ultimately more of a process automation use case as opposed to some super bleeding edge Gen AI agentic system, because that just tends to be overkill for most of what we're trying to accomplish.
I don't think Josh is going to disagree with that.
No. No, but I think you're right. I will violently agree with the fact that there is a value in sparking some sort of sense of creative innovation and getting people to think about this. And this is going back to where we started with, how do you get that to that business case? How do you get the business user to the business case, particularly the business user who says, "Yeah, I love my ECC. Well, I love this screen. I love how this works." Let's showing them some some maybe overreaching and over complex version of an AI thing could lead them to at least consider the fact that, if we just automate this thing, if we just do this a little bit smarter, we can get a lot of value out of it. So I'm all for that. I think, and by the way, I'm just going to plug John because he needs to be plugged on his own podcast, but you've been really kicking ass on writing about AI. And I've been reading these blog posts, and, the value proposition against the cost is a really strong story to be telling, because we are, if you care to look at what's happening with electrical generation in this country and the attempt to actually decarbonize our economy, the AI data centers are destroying every single effort that we are having to do that. And for what purpose is a really good question that we actually need to be asking. And we as technologists need to maybe stand up and say, we can fix some of these business problems in ways that don't consume that much power. I was in Southern California last week. I have a particular sort of dog in this fight in terms of seeing what climate change is doing to our world. And so, maybe we don't need that much, LLM, ChatGPT driven AI to solve our business problems. Sparking conversations is a great idea, but let's leave the sparks, behind consumption, please.
Well, and we can get into this another time, but Brian, you're right. And I think it's also provoking an AI readiness conversation, which is a really welcome rethink of data quality, data privacy, data governance, and all of that stuff. And just like you pointed to process automation, in many cases, pretty straightforward analytics solutions are often pretty compelling as well. And so there's a lot you can do once you start really bearing down on that. And so that's probably the silver lining to some of the hype, I would say. So, all right. So let's stop because we're just about out of time, but I do want to do a little round robin here. And, this is a little tough because customers are in a different place, but if you, having talked about everything we talked about so far, what would kind of be your advice to customers in terms of navigating the complexities of everything we talked about, and how can they kind of stay on top of this and do things right? And obviously user group involvement and user groups like ASUG or DSAG or wherever, that's kind of a given. But what do you think customers should be doing to kind of stay on top of this?
Oh, Brian, go right ahead.
Sure. I can go first. So, I think what I was talking before about the idea of innovation and technical debt, I think that's really kind of the end all be all story of this. And whether you're pre-rise, you're in the middle of rise, or you're post-rise, you should really be trying to look at the world through the lens of, am I shedding technical debts? Am I putting my customizations in the right place so that I can sweat those assets without making them a long-term burden for myself? Like, that really is kind of the name of the game. That is the new modern SAP architecture. That is why SAP is going in this direction of becoming a SaaS product. That whole vision, in large part, is to enable cleaner data, better use of AI. And so as long as you kind of get on that trajectory and you're doing the right enablement and understanding the modern SAP architecture and the modern toolkit, you're going to be in a good spot. Just stop making investments in places where it turns into technical debts. That is kind of the simple message that I could give to everyone consistently.
And my simple message isn't going to be simple because I was actually teeing up a topic we didn't even discuss that could send us down a rabbit hole. But I think when I talk to customers and particularly looking at where the tooling is evolving, I'm encouraging them to really use this evolutionary vision of what BTP and Cloud ALM and Signavio can do to engage with the non-SAP side of the businesses about this, my favorite topic, silo busting, about building out the real value of technology and that's allowing it to span these unnecessary and unfortunate historic silos. that have been in every medium to large size enterprise since the beginning of time. And I think what I like about the story the understory of all this, both this technology and this evolution of RISE, is that you are now able to really, as the SAP lead in a company, say, we despite maybe what you're hearing up there, that my way or the highway, wall-to-wall SAP or nothing, there's actually a very realistic and strong alternative to that, which is that we will integrate with what you've got. You talked about that a second ago, Brian. There are these tools now that let us manage this level of complexity and really drive business value despite, if you will, maybe a previous technological imperative that was there because it was good for a vendor, not necessarily good for a customer.
So I'm going to add to the mix, build a little bit on Brian's point. I realize that not every customer, everyone listening, is in a position to have these conversations with your employer, but I believe it starts with an industry modernization conversation. How are we going to compete in our industry going forward? And nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with SAP, nothing. And if you're not part of those conversations, your employer, at the very least, you can have a personal conversation with yourself about that from a skills development standpoint and where you need to go as an individual. Again, not SAP specific. Then I think it's a matter of the AI piece, where sometimes you do have to reckon with AI because maybe some of your higher ups are asking you about that. So you do have to engage with that a little bit. But I would say it's more, what is our narrative around the future of work and automation, and how are we going to create an empowering environment for our people within that context that isn't fear-based and feels like a surveillance economy where their digital exhaust is leading to their own demise. And then the final thing I would say would be, now you know how SAP is going to fit into that, and that's where the dialogue has to happen with SAP, and strongly encourage things like user groups and an agnostic services partner to help you advocate for some of this stuff. Because even during this podcast, we covered many different routes to the same end result, and you might not necessarily get that from your first conversation with SAP, right? Where you figure out, well, actually, we can access this outside of RISE, or actually, Grow is going to be better for us than RISE, and here's why. I think an agnostic service partner that can really advise you around your industry issues in an SAP context is vital. So that would kind of be where I would want to start and take it from there. So
sounds great.
Yeah. So let's do it, man.
The digital exhaust is leading to their demise. I'm
saying, man, it's getting a little dicey out there, man. I'm hearing, head count reduction stuff all the time. And it's
and just to close on what I was talking about with telemetry, I mean, that's the flip side. Okay. Too much telemetry. It's too much.
Well, it's about trust, right? I mean, if you're going to be monitored in that way, I think you're right to expect some type of trust around that data. And
God, we can't quit, can we, guys?
No, man. I mean,
trying to stay quiet.
No, I mean,
I gotta head out the door any minute. But this
could just go on and on. But it's hard to put a wrap on it. But thanks. This was everything I'd hoped for and more. I'm sure we will reconvene at some point. But thanks for this, guys. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, of course.
Looking forward to the next round.